Winnipeg's home for me. My new home for the moment is in Manila, but if home's where the heart is, then Winnipeg is very much my home. And I have a number of friends in the Philippine community, including Fred. And I've always felt that I'm getting more towards the end of my career. Fred knew me when I had a full head of brown chestnut colored hair, so it was a number of years ago. But I have to say, for me, having the opportunity now to come kind of full circle in terms of my career, having started in Winnipeg, having seen the contribution that the Philippine community has made to the city of Winnipeg, socially, culturally, economically, any way you want to measure contribution, this community has given a great deal to the city of Winnipeg and the people of Canada, and I hope you've all benefited from the opportunity to be here as well. I want to compliment you on this fine facility as well. When I was last in Winnipeg in an official capacity, I wasn't aware that this facility existed, so again, it's a credit to the community that you've got such a fine facility in place. As Fred mentioned, I've been in the Philippines now, in Manila, since July of last year. There was a lot of things I anticipated, and they've kind of come true. There's some things I didn't anticipate before I went to the Philippines. I was asked when I got here, am I enjoying my time in the Philippines? I said, I enjoy it very, very much. It's a great opportunity and a privilege to have a chance to make the difference in the lives of people, an opportunity to make a difference for people in Canada, for employers who are looking for employees, the opportunity to make a difference in the Philippines as well, you know, and for individual families. So I feel very privileged to have the opportunity that I have. But some of the things I didn't anticipate, I didn't realize how much Filipino people eat. It's unbelievable, you know. I mean, everything revolves around food. You know, there's a celebration for everything. There's a merienda for every possible reason. The other thing I didn't realize is that there's sort of two categories of Filipinos: those who can sing and those who believe they can sing. So the reality is, everybody sings, and all Filipinos seem to be performers. And so that's, you get in the elevator and people will be humming and singing, and, you know, but that also speaks to sort of a resilient spirit as well. Because I've witnessed people living in some very difficult conditions. We went through a typhoon last September. There was a lot of devastation in the city of Manila, but there was no devastation to the spirit of the Philippine people. They just kept right on going. They were cutting the trees, cleaning the streets, and getting things back in order. But there were no long faces. Everybody continued smiling and singing. So what I wanted to have a chance to talk to you about today, and I've met with members of the Philippine community in Vancouver, Toronto, Ottawa, and now with you here in Winnipeg. And it's just to recognize that the immigration business is a difficult business. And the Philippine people, the other thing I've come to appreciate and realize is that one of the things that's most important to Filipinos are relationships. And when you talk about immigration, you're talking about relationships. And so anything that we can do together to make our relationship better, anything that we can do so that you can understand some of the challenges that we have, and then I can understand maybe where you feel we could do a better job. Let's, you know, do a better job of working together to make things more understandable and function a little bit better. The other thing I can tell you is that Canadian provinces and employers have discovered the Philippines. I know that Manitoba discovered the Filipinos a long time ago. The province of Manitoba has been very active in recruiting Filipinos through the provincial nominee program, but other provinces are getting on board as well. Many provinces are looking to copy, in fact, the work that's been done here in Manitoba over the last number of years. And the Philippines now is the #3 source country for immigrants to Canada. India, #1, China, #2, and the Philippines, the #3 source country. So I just want to talk to you about the immigration program, some of the challenges that we have, what we've seen in terms of the volumes of cases that we're dealing with, and just have an opportunity for some questions and answers as well. So I always find a pretty good place to start with this kind of discussion is in terms of what are Canada's objectives when it comes to immigration. So what Canada's looking to do is to improve and maximize the contribution that immigrants make in terms of the social, the cultural, and the economic benefit, has certainly contributed on all those levels. So what we do is we bring people to Canada as members of a family class, as skilled workers, in business, as entrepreneurs, as investors, and also as refugees. And all those categories are mutually reinforcing. You couldn't have one group without extending help to the others as well. We also try to make sure that the integration prospects that people have are optimized. So we try to ensure that to the extent possible, individuals arrive with the kind of skills that they will need in order to be successful here in Canada, recognizing there are still challenges in terms of things like credential recognition, some of the issues around even interprovincial barriers to having credentials recognized, getting the equivalency for education that's been received in the Philippines and having it recognized here in Canada. We also look to facilitate the admission of people who want to come to Canada temporarily. So those who want to come to visit, those who want to come as students, those who want to come here as temporary workers. And the flip side to the facilitation work that we do is the trying to ensure that we also make sure that people that come here merit the opportunity to come to Canada, and that we protect the health and safety and good order of Canadian society as well. So making sure that people are of good health, good character before they come to Canada. We also look to support provincial immigration goals. So I talked about the provincial nominee program that Ben will talk to you about in a few minutes. And largely because of the efforts of the provincial government here in Manitoba, the Philippines is the #1 source country for provincial nominees. So, you know, the way I like to characterize it is that if you were to go out and ask provinces and ask employers, if you could select immigrants from any country in the world, which is the place that you would most like to go to? And up to this point, and for the foreseeable future, the Philippines has been and continues to be the #1 source country for provincial nominees. You know, if I take a look at the importance that immigration has placed in Canada's history, we go back to the turn of the century and post-World War II Canada. You know, we were looking to develop the nation. We were looking to have people till the soil, establish communities, establish their families. And the movement over that period of time was principally a European-based movement. But we've seen over the last 30, 40 years, there's been a shift, and the shift has been more away from Europe and more to Asia. So as I mentioned, India, China, Philippines, Pakistan are now the top 4 source countries for immigrants to Canada. But in terms of the need for immigrants, we're also an aging population, a declining birth rate, yet with a very robust and booming economy. So increasingly, we have employers coming to us desperate for workers, and desperate for workers at all skill levels, professional, managerial, tradespeople, as well as low-skilled workers as well. The office in Manila, we're what we call a regional processing center, so we have responsibility not just for the Philippines, but for immigration processing out of Japan as well. Last year, we processed over 14,000 immigrant visas and about 38,000 temporary resident visas. We have 87 staff, 13 of those are Canadians and Canada-based officers, and the other 74 are local Filipinos who work with us. And if it wasn't for that locally engaged staff, I mean, they're very much the backbone and the corporate memory of the office. The Canadian officers, every 2 to 3 years, they change over, but it's the Filipino locally engaged staff that really are the carryover from one generation of Canada-based officers to the next. If we look at the Philippines, population of about 86 million people, about 10% of that population works abroad. It's getting close to 500,000 Filipinos that are now in Canada. Remittances continue to be very important to the Philippines, and it's now about $15 billion that went last year back to the Philippines by way of remittances, and that represents about 12% of the GDP, of the gross domestic product, for the Philippines. So it's the single largest element of GDP to the Philippines. So clearly very, very important. We work very closely also with the Philippine government, with the Department of Labor, with the Philippine Overseas Employment Agency, with TESDA, the Technical Education Skill Development Administration, with OWA, the Overseas Worker Welfare Administration, and with Department of Foreign Affairs, to ensure that to the extent that we can, we have a harmonious relationship. And sometimes we get into this discussion about are we engaged in a brain drain from the Philippines? And the way the Philippine government characterizes it, they view it more as a brain gain, because every time a worker leaves, it creates an opportunity for someone else. The remittances continue to come back. Many Filipinos will return to the Philippines with newfound skills, newfound ways of doing business. And so overall, the government continues to be encouraging of people having the opportunity to live and work overseas. Canada is also a preferred destination for Filipinos. So those of you that have arrived here, what I'm telling you is probably not any great secrets or anything like that or anything novel, but there's a large percentage of Philippine workers that go to the Gulf, they go to the Middle East, Saudi, Lebanon, Kuwait, and workers are not treated very well in many of those countries. We saw in the evacuation of Lebanon, there were domestics there who were virtual prisoners in Lebanon. They weren't allowed to leave, even when the devastation was going on. Passports are taken from them, so they can't travel. They become a virtual prisoner. Sometimes they're locked in homes. There were cases of 3 individuals who tried to escape by tying bed sheets together. They were in a tall apartment complex. The bed sheets came apart. 3 of them fell to their death. And so the Philippine government has often said, well, what are you going to do to protect our workers? And one of the things that the government is encouraging people to do is to be able to go to countries that have an infrastructure, have a labor board, have contracts, have a more enforceable way of trying to ensure, to the extent possible, that workers are protected, are properly being looked after. So there's some push and pressure on the part of the Philippine government also to encourage its citizens to go to Canada. And in fact, the Labor Secretary, Arturo Brion, he has indicated that he would like to send a delegation to Canada from the Philippines to do a recruitment and promotion drive, and they're intending to come here as early as August of this year. So there are 2 kinds of visas that we process, one for permanent residents and the other is for temporary residents. In the permanent resident category, we deal with family class cases and we also deal with economic class cases. So the family class, spouses, dependent children, parents, grandparents, and in the economic category, skilled workers, provincial nominees, investors, entrepreneurs, and self-employed. And as I mentioned, with temporary residents, it's visitors, students, and the temporary workers. And within that temporary worker category, we also have the live-in caregivers as well. So that's a significant part of that group. There's also a medical program that we administer in the Philippines, and that medical program is responsible for not only the Philippines, but also Japan and Korea. And last year, they processed over 47,000 medical assessments. We also have a migration integrity unit. So we work with the airlines, we work with other embassies, we work with law enforcement in the Philippines to ensure that we're able to determine, what are the fraudulent documents that some people are using, because sometimes we know that Filipino people are very resourceful people, and most of the time it's all for good, but there is a percentage out there that, there's always a few bad apples in any group, and we need to be vigilant in terms of trying to identify who and where those individuals are. If I do some comparisons of the volumes of work that we've seen over the last few years, it's been a steady increase in the amount of applications that we've been receiving. So if I were to go back to 2003, we received about 6,100 applications for people wanting to come to Canada as permanent residents. And last year, 2006, it was almost 12,000. So it almost doubled in the span of that time. Yet we're only able to process about 7,000 applications a year. So what it means is that there's 4,000 cases that we can't get at, and that inventory just grows and grows and grows. to the point where right now we've got about 25,000 skilled worker applications that are sitting in a queue, and those are going to take 4 to 5 years for us to be able to process. So that's a long time. And the challenge that I have is I don't control the intake of applications. I only have a say in terms of what we're able to produce, and that is somewhat limited in terms of our capacity to process, and also the immigration levels that get announced every year. The minister normally in the first week of November will announce what the immigration levels are going to be for the coming year. Now, when I look at provincial nominee cases, in 2004 we issued almost 1,100 provincial nominee cases, visas, and in 2006 almost 2,300 visas. And so far this year, just from January to the end of May, we've issued just over 1,600. So if I were to compare the first 5 months of this year with the first 5 months of last year, the volumes are up about 84%. And that in large measure is because provinces like Saskatchewan, Alberta, British Columbia are starting to copy some of the work that's been done here by the province of Manitoba in encouraging provincial nominee cases. I mentioned temporary residence, again, 2003, about 28,000 applications, 2006, 38,000 applications. And the biggest growth area in the temporary resident group has been with temporary workers. So not counting caregivers, live-in caregivers, we get between 5,000 and 7,000 applications every year. But for workers, if I were to go back to 2004, so other temporary workers, not caregivers, 2004, we had less than 400 applications for the whole year. In 2005, about 850 applications for the whole year. And in 2006, we had almost 3,700 applications. So we went from 850 to 3,700. So that increase was about 330%. And this year, compared to last year, we've already received as many applications for temporary worker applications for the first 5 months of this year as we had received in all of 2006. So we're running about 250% ahead of last year, which again was already over 300% of the year previous. So this has an impact overall on the processing times. I mentioned permanent residents, so these are the skilled workers, people putting in an application, no provincial nominee, not a family class application, not someone who has prearranged employment that's been validated by Services Canada, but someone who's just coming in and filing a skilled worker application. It's going to take 4 to 5 years for us to get at that application as it stands right now. But for spouses and dependent children, we're able to process 80% of those cases within 6 months. So we're putting a lot of emphasis on getting families reunited. If I were to look at what the figures were going back to the end of 2005, we were only doing about 50% of those cases within 6 months. So to go from 50% to 80% is quite significant. And in fact, we're now doing 50% of those cases of spouses and dependent children within 4 months. So we've improved there. Provincial nominee cases, we process the majority of those within 8 to 11 months. Visitor cases, 2 to 3 weeks. Now the temporary workers, they've gone up to about 14 weeks to process a temporary worker. A year ago, it would have been about 3 weeks, but the numbers have gone up so sharply that we're now looking at 14 weeks. So we're having to get some additional resources, and we'll be getting some additional staff this summer in the hope that we can start to bring that number back down. The live-in caregivers, when I arrived in the Philippines last summer, there was a backlog of 2 to 2.5 years. There was 9,300 applications in process. And so if someone were to come in and say, well, I need a caregiver to look after my children, to look after my aged parents, it was going to take 2 to 2.5 years before that application could be processed. And you may not know if it's going to be processed successfully or not, but it would take 2.5 years to find out. So what we've done is that we put measures in place to ensure that all the applications that have been filed prior to the middle of November 2006, I expect to have all of those cases concluded by the end of this summer. Okay, so that's a significant improvement. And the hope is that we can start to look at processing times for caregivers that look a lot more like the processing times for temporary workers, which we would measure in terms of weeks or months and not in terms of years. So again, a lot of work has gone on there. If I look down to the future to say, you know, what do I anticipate happening? Well, I anticipate that the demand for immigrants, and both permanent residents and temporary residents, is going to continue to be there. There's going to continue to be a demand in Canada. You know, we're seeing it very, very strongly in the West, you know, and it's right across the West. I was in British Columbia a week ago, Monday, and we talked to representatives from the provincial government there, and they indicated that they need about 35,000 permanent workers annually to fill the gaps that are anticipated in the labor market there, and another 22 to 24,000 temporary workers. And traditionally, they've been able to get a certain percentage of those workers from other parts of the country. So people were moving from Atlantic Canada to go to British Columbia, those sorts of things, and from other parts of the West as well. But what they're finding is that the economy of Canada is doing very well, and that you know, that wealth, that you know, that optimism is being felt right across the country, maybe to varying degrees, but it's being felt across the country. So the concern for British Columbia is that they're not going to be able to attract individuals the way that they have in the past from within Canada, so increasingly they're going to have to look offshore. And when they look offshore, they look, you know, to a number of countries, but the Philippines figures very prominently, in large measure because, you know, English speaking, good work ethic, people understand what it means to work abroad, you know, and whether it's to move permanently or to go temporarily and then come back. You know, the reputation of the Philippine worker is very, very positive. So I would anticipate that the demand is going to continue, and I think it's going to continue to escalate. You know, in terms of the things that we have to do a better job of managing the inventories that we have. Some of it is within my control, some of it is not within my control, but I recognize that there's a need to do better. We need to do a better job of being partners with employers, with recruiters, with the community, in terms of how we manage this flow of people from abroad into Canada. I mentioned the relationship that we have with the government of the Philippines. It's a very positive relationship, a very strong relationship, and we need to continue to foster that. We need to continue to take steps to address fraud, and that's you know, applicants. I mean, we have fraud in our casework. We have employers who don't always honor the terms of their contracts. We have recruiters. There's a real problem with recruiters in the Philippines, and we're trying to educate the government and the recruiters to say, if you, in the Canadian model, you don't charge the worker 1 penny, not 1 peso, when they're coming to Canada. We've seen horror stories of people that have sold their homes, families that have pooled all their monies together in the interest of trying to send one family member overseas so that they could in turn send money back, maybe help to educate other family members and provide for their family. But in truth, in the Canadian model, you don't pay anything. You know, it's the employer that pays, and slowly we're starting to see some improvements in that area as well. We also have some issues with some of the educational institutions in the Philippines. Many do a very good job. Others are just in it for profit. You know, they just set up a school, and if you were to go visit that school, you would wonder, how can you call yourself a school? There's no books, there's no curriculum, there's barely, you know, there's not even a building. But they manage to churn out certificates and these sorts of things. So, you know, there's some issues that way as well. I believe the Philippines will absolutely continue to be one of the top source countries for immigrants to Canada, and again, both permanent and temporary workers. Our office will be, you know, continue to be very, very busy. You know, we'll continue to be pushed to get our processing times down as the volumes continue to go up. So that's going to be a huge challenge for us. But it's like I mentioned at the beginning, that it is a privilege at the same time to be in a position where you can actually have some influence, where you can work to improve the lives of those people that you're selecting to come to Canada, improve the situation for Canadians and for Canadian employers, at the same time do a benefit to the people and the government of the Philippines, and recognize that it's a real winning combination, right? So you have a country that's quite open and willing to have its citizens relocate elsewhere, and Canada as a receiving country, and as someone who has witnessed firsthand here in Winnipeg the contribution that this community has made, I feel very gratified. I've never done missionary work in my life, but this is as close to missionary work as I've ever gotten, and I'm really appreciative of the opportunity. So with that, Maraming salamat po.